Before I start, sorry about the constant humming in the background. If you guys can hear that, I'm speaking through a microphone, but it might be picking it up. The whole building is buzzing for some reason. I have no idea why, but just wanted to disclaim that. Sorry if that bugs you in any way. Ranking movies is always tough. Just recently I watched Scott Pilgrim vs. the World for the first time, and I really enjoyed it. I loved the editing, the humor, the action, basically the majority of the film I was very entertained by. And yet, I find it near impossible to discern whether I like it better than a movie like, say, The Shawshank Redemption. The Shawshank Redemption is a fantastic film that I also thoroughly enjoyed, and is a movie that is often brought up when talking about the greatest movies of all time, and I can definitely see why that's the case. And yet, when I set it against Scott Pilgrim, a movie that most people agree is great, but not best of all time material, and I try to compare the two and which one I like better, it's somehow very difficult. Do I rank them based on rewatchability, on my enjoyment level, on humor, on drama, on cinematography, on editing, on score, on dialogue? Really, the two movies can flip back and forth for me, depending on the criteria that I'm comparing them by. And if I try to go the route of taking absolutely everything I just mentioned into account, how much weight do I put on each individual element? Surely the writing should contribute to my ranking way more than the editing should. Scott Pilgrim made me laugh way more than Shawshank, of course, but Shawshank made me way more emotional than Scott Pilgrim. Ranking any movie versus another, namely when talking about movies that an individual enjoys to a very high degree, is not an easy thing to do. As such, it typically takes a lot of thought and potentially a few rewatches for me to see if a movie stacks up to some of my favorite movies of all time, like The Dark Knight, or The Lion King, Inglourious Basterds, Into the Spider-Verse, just to name a few. But in the case of 1917, I never had to pose the question of whether this film belonged among the ranks of my favorite films of all time, because by the time the credits had rolled, I had already placed it in that category without any hesitation. I think there's many things that the movie does extremely well that catapults it so quickly up my personal ranking of the films that I've seen, but in this video I'll be focusing mainly on how its use of simplicity, even through techniques that were anything but simple, is what allows the movie to be incredibly engrossing and intense. And I'll do that by talking about two mutually supportive components of the film: its insistence on maintaining the most linear of storylines, and its usage of the one-shot film technique. And don't worry, I won't be spoiling anything. 1917 is a film by pop star Shawn Mendes starring pop star Harry Styles. Alternatively, Harry Styles stars in a completely different war movie. The director is Sam Mendes, and I have dyslexia. That would explain why I can never spell the word attached. The film follows two soldiers who have been given a mission to head across no man's land and send a message to an Allied general who is about to inadvertently lead his soldiers into a trap. And that's it. It's not often that a synopsis can be so all-encompassing of the totality of a movie's plot. Take, for example, The Dark Knight. A quick look at IMDb shows us the plot synopsis for the film. When the menace known as the Joker wreaks havoc and chaos to the people of Gotham, Batman must accept one of the greatest psychological and physical tests of his ability to fight injustice. This synopsis is almost equal in length to the one I just provided for 1917, even a bit longer, and yet it mentions absolutely nothing about the character that is arguably just as important to the overall story as Joker or Batman: Harvey Dent. It mentions nothing about Batman trying to retire and to present Gotham with a white knight to idolize instead. It doesn't talk about the mob's involvement and their role in quote-unquote letting the Joker off the leash. That's not the exact quote, but you know what I mean. It mentions nothing about the fight for the soul of Gotham, etc., etc. That doesn't make it a bad synopsis. It actually sums up the movie as best as you can using only one sentence, but that's the point that I'm trying to make. So much goes on in The Dark Knight that the synopsis can only capture some parts of the large, overarching story. The same can be said for most movies out there. Characters have their own motivations. Certain events can change their outlooks on life. They can be derailed from their original path that they envisioned at the beginning of the film. Maybe there's a villain with his or her own conflicting motivation. The list goes on and on. Even a film like Toy Story, where the main goal of the film is for Buzz and Woody to make their way back to Andy, focuses much more on character development, understanding friendship, finding your place in the world, believing in yourself, and even when you take all the messages and themes of the movie away, the plot of getting back to Andy is broken up into smaller plots of them at Pizza Planet getting grabbed by Sid, and later finding a way to intimidate Sid and escape from his house. Smaller sections of story that they need to complete in order to complete the overarching plot. I'm not going to pretend like I've watched every film in the world and therefore know that there's no other film like 1917 that presents the main goal.
My main goal is to blow up and then act like I don't know nobody.
Well, that was was weird. I'm not gonna pretend like I've watched every film in the world and therefore know that there's no other film like 1917 that presents the main goal within the first 5 minutes of the movie and keeps the focus on this one goal and this one goal only for the remainder of the 1 hour and 54-minute runtime, but I can say with a fair amount of certainty that if any other movies do adopt this method of storytelling, they are incredibly sparse in numbers compared to movies that don't head in this direction. I urge you to think of any film that truly keeps your focus on one thing and one thing only for the entire runtime of the movie, and they never diverge from that objective. The only scene in this film that I feel might have an argument for giving us a break from the scenario is, to keep it vague to avoid spoilers, the baby scene. And still, the movie continues to feel as if it's constantly pushing us to keep thinking about the final objective, and it does so through the other unique element of this movie, the element that typically comes up first when discussing 1917. And that, of course, is that the entire movie is designed to look like a one-shot. As most of you probably know, a one-shot is when a director decides to ditch the typical style of filmmaking where they cut between different shots, such as profile shots, wide shots, close-ups, blah blah blah, and instead only use one camera to follow everything that's happening in the scene. Typically, these are hard to pull off and they require tons of rehearsal, especially since these shots are usually the most effective when there's a lot of movement on screen. So why implement them into your TV show or movie if they're so hard to pull off? Well, for starters, they typically look great, they're usually incredibly fun scenes to watch and audiences are impressed by them, but the main function of these shots is usually to immerse the audience as much as possible. Take the Daredevil fight scene in season 3 of the show, rest in peace. The one shot here runs for about 10 minutes if I remember correctly, and mixes fighting, dialogue, and more fighting into its lengthy time span. It makes for an incredibly exciting scene, but more than that, it helps us understand Matt's struggle much more viscerally, as we've been seeing him fight like hell non-stop for nearly 10 minutes. And on top of that, because this is a scene where he is breaking out of prison, using the one-shot method allows us to feel as though we are escaping with him, and the tension in turn is amplified. This scene is one of the longest one-shots I've seen personally, and is in my opinion a perfect example of how it can be used to make action and even basic movement much more interesting and immersive to the viewer, but it also shows some of the shortcomings of the technique as well. Typically in an action scene, if it requires a stunt double, the constant movement as well as quick cuts when impact is made can easily hide the fact that a double is even being used, at least to the untrained eye. I would know I am an untrained eye. In this 10-minute sequence, however, the slower, more brawly style of fighting that is used, along with the fact that cuts can't be used to fool our eyes, ends up making it incredibly easy to tell when a stunt double is being used, and when Charlie Cox is hiding behind a prop getting ready for his stuntman to get knocked down so he can crawl out from behind there. It's ridiculous to think then that anyone would even consider making a feature-length film that consisted entirely of one-shots, and yet somehow Sam the Sadist Mendes decides that's exactly what he's gonna do. But what I find interesting is that what could have been a novel gimmick is actually exactly what was needed to culminate every part of the film and bring it together in a way that goes way beyond a fun little camera trick. While in some areas it's easy to see when they probably cut and continued at a separate time, like when the characters enter a dark corridor or a tree goes by, at other times I find myself wondering if they had even cut at all in the past 30 minutes. That combined with how the crew would have had to wait until the sun was in a specific position to continue one shot from before, or wait for the right weather, or build an entire set based on the length of the scene, makes the whole thing incredibly fascinating from a technical standpoint. But there's plenty of videos out there outlining the long and difficult process of making this movie, and as impressive as it all is, I'd like to focus on its importance to actually telling the story at hand. Like I mentioned before, 1917 is unique in its storytelling by providing us with a storyline that goes directly from A to B. If you were to make a timeline for almost any other movie, it would probably have a lot more zigzagging along the way. Perhaps it never reaches B and instead winds up at C. Maybe it crosses through B and then to C. Maybe it comes back around to A. But in 1917, it's very clear A to B. With tons of mud and hurdles in between, of course, but these simply make the straight line more difficult. They never cause the story to deviate from the line itself. It's for this reason that framing this movie as a one-shot is so effective. The whole point of the movie is to see the characters try to walk this line, and therefore creating a method of viewing this journey without obstruction of any kind is the perfect way to immerse the audience in the world and the mission completely. You not only see every obstacle and every pitfall, but also every footstep that these characters take in trying to reach their destination. The movie uses this technique to suck you into the movie like it's Jumanji. You feel as though you're side by side with these characters as they embark on what may be a suicide mission in hopes that they can somehow miraculously survive and save 1,600 lives. Another major factor of the movie that's affected by the way it's filmed is the tension and intensity. There's a scene in the film where the characters are within 100 feet of an area that they believe to be abandoned and they make their way over. At this point in most films, the camera would cut to them already in the area, looking around with their guns raised to see if anyone was hiding out there. The cut provides somewhat of a breather from the tension. Clearly the movie didn't have to show their approach to the area, and therefore the approach was not dangerous, and we second-handedly feel a little better knowing that for a split second, there was safety for our characters. In addition to that, if there were people hiding in this area, we subconsciously know that it would be revealed to us after at least a few seconds of looking around, as the film had to start ramping up tension once again in order to make a potential ambush feel startling and intense. It's for this reason that our period of relaxation is further increased. In 1917, however, absolutely no time is given to the viewer to feel as though our characters are safe. Due to maintaining the one shot throughout the film, once the characters say the area is abandoned, we watch as they carefully approach the buildings before they even reached anywhere near them. All of a sudden, the potential room for us to feel as though our characters will be okay is removed, and instead is replaced with doubt and fear that even when approaching the seemingly safe area, they could be in imminent danger. The result is a movie that doesn't present tension in the same way that most movies do, where it ebbs and flows and allows us to take a breath in the middle of the more intense moments, but instead leads to a film that continuously increases the audience's stress levels further and further until they're practically holding their breath for the entirety of the climax, and then finally, after 2 hours, allows us to relax. By creating a story that was incredibly focused and linear in nature and framing that story in the rawest, most immersive way possible, 1917 becomes the perfect example of how complex narratives, flashy action, and even an emphasis on character or dialogue is not actually necessary for a movie to be, at least in my opinion, one of the best action dramas of all time. There's a beauty in its simplicity, and for anyone who hasn't watched it yet, I recommend you remedy that as soon as you possibly can. The next post will probably be a lot more comedy focused. It'll most likely end up being a skit, so look out for that, although considering my recent track record, it probably won't be posted for another 5 months. Regardless, if you made it this far, I hope you enjoyed. Let me know if you liked it, and I'll see you next time. Peace.